Welcome to the second in our series of 3 workshops on AI and experience. These are sponsored by the Center for Applied Ethics at the University of Massachusetts at Boston. We're going to be recording this session. I'm joined from the center by Nir Isikovich in the top of my screen anyway, waving, and Jay Hughes, who will be our first speaker, and Maria Brincker, who will be our second speaker. And I'm a senior fellow at the center. Without any further ado, let me introduce Jay. James Hughes is a bioethicist and sociologist who has served as the Associate Provost for Institutional Research, Assessment, and Planning for the University of Massachusetts, Boston. He is the co-founder and executive director of the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, which is a techno-progressive think tank. And he's going to be talking about individuation and the algorithmic shaping of taste.
Okay, so my coping strategy over the last 4 years for hiding from fascist chaos is to immerse myself in popular culture. And so I have a very intimate relationship with recommender algorithms at this point. And I thought I would just start by illustrating 2 passions that my wife and I are sharing as we are in our bunker. The first came to us, the kind of a passion for Asian boy love, that is homophilic depictions in contemporary Asian culture of a variety of sorts. And it came to us because my daughter has a friend in Korea, and her friend in Korea became a fan of the Korean boy band BTS, of which you see the character Jimin here. My wife absorbs everything that my daughter is thinking about at any time and wants to be a passionate participant in her life. And so she began to follow BTS, which meant I had to follow BTS. We all became fans of this dancer, Jimin. Then the friend in Korea recommended a Chinese gay-themed soap opera called The Untamed. We've now watched all 50 episodes twice and read the underground novel. I want to learn more Chinese, so that's been a passion for that reason as well. And that led us to watching more Chinese soap operas. So our life is now very much wrapped up in Korean boy bands and Chinese soap operas because of personal connections. On the other hand, I'm also now a fan of these 2 Ukrainian bands, Dakabraka and Onuka. And when I reflected on how I became even aware of them and much less a fan, it was because I had gone into YouTube over the last 10 years and started telling YouTube what kinds of music videos I liked. I've subscribed to a couple dozen artists' channels, and they also gauge your engagement by how long you stay on a particular product. Eventually, they started recommending NPR Tiny Desk concerts, which were often the kinds of unusual, specialized, international world BD kind of music that I like, which led to a Korean folk pop group, which led to Mongolian heavy metal group called The Who. And I think after they tagged me as that kind of guy, they started to recommend Dakabraka and Onuka. I recommend them highly, but I wouldn't have ever discovered them through friends or family, or even, if I was reading exotic music journals, I might have discovered them. But basically, they got served up to me, and I'm very grateful. So that's a frame for the overall question. What's the difference between discovering aesthetic tastes or exploring your aesthetic tastes before algorithms and with algorithms? There is a narrative around the internet bubble, the internet radicalization, the corporate shaping of taste, and all of this, which I'm trying to push back on. Not that I don't think we live under the control of capitalism, we obviously do, and corporate entities are the ruling ideas of the age. Our aesthetics are deeply infused with power. I agree with all of that. What I'm saying is these particular tools may enable more than simply control. They may enable self-exploration, individuation, as I'm going to call it. The fact that in the field of epistemology and politics, we're worried about hyperspecialization, which may reduce our common shared understandings. But in the field of aesthetics, we have a different set of attitudes because we generally valorize more specialized aesthetic tastes. And I'll get to why in a second. So the question, I think, and this is going to be more about setting up the question because the research is pretty scant at this point, but I'll get to that in a second. The question, I think, is, do algorithmic recommendations simply reflect our aesthetic consumption, or are they influencing our aesthetic consumption in some way that is systematic to make us more generalist or specialist or omnivore or not? Are they enforcing some kind of global cultural homogeneity, or are they taking us in the opposite direction of the aesthetic version of internet radicalization? So this is, I think, a very poignant, a very distilled summary from Ariely, paper that came out 2 years ago. She asks, we need to ask if our preferences and tastes are undergoing a process of global homogenization through the convergence of consumption habits and content led by algorithms, or if instead we witness an increasing plurality or fragmentation of styles and trends and aesthetic preferences because of the increasing drilling down into people's bubbles of personalized cultural choices. Or it could be that hyperconnectivity means that you get identified as being a member of this tiny set and this tiny set, and the overlapping of all the tiny sets that you're in is actually a hyper-personalization, so that the internet actually does drill down on, at least behaviorally, a unique set of characteristics for you. Or the algorithms track and suggest pieces of content that are pertinent to specific social attributes, reference Bourdieu, that would not weaken, but would even reinforce your cultural belonging. So in other words, you might be a part of a group, and what the algorithms are figuring out is that you're part of that group, and these are the things that your group likes, and you should be more like your group. So there are many different ways that these tools might impact our aesthetic tastes. So let me rewind for a second and say what I mean by aesthetics and how I think about aesthetics. I'm a Humean on this stuff. I don't think that there is beauty in the world. I think that that's something that we invented in our head. And therefore, any person's aesthetic choice is just as normatively valid as anybody else's aesthetic choice. To the extent that there are authentic individual aesthetic choices, which I don't believe there really are, the only things that we can really find neuroaesthetically that human beings might have biologically conditioned explain more or less why we don't have certain kinds of art. We don't have music in the supersonic because we can't hear it. We don't have art in the ultraviolet because we can't see it. But most of the things that impact us neuroaesthetically are human universals. They don't tell us why you like rock and why you like classical, although there are some things that go in that direction. Most of the conditioning of our aesthetic differentiation is because of social factors. The reason that some people are attracted to Star Trek versus Star Wars is because of their social conditioning and social determination. However, so I'll get to the individuation part in a second, but let's talk about Bourdieu, because Bourdieu is a landmark in this field, at least for the social sciences. Pierre Bourdieu was trying to explore the way that taste gets framed, and he used statistical techniques, data reduction techniques that are remarkably similar, but basically the same. They're in the same family of techniques as most of the techniques that are used by preference algorithms today. He tried to put together, if you like opera, do you like classical, do you like polo, do you like soccer, et cetera, all these different questions, all these different questions. And let's see, I can't even see the quote. The point of my work is to show that culture and education aren't simply hobbies or minor influences. They're hugely important in the affirmation of differences between groups and social classes and the reproduction of those differences. So for left-wing social science, the big upshot is that each class has habitus, has groupings of cultural practices, understandings, knowledge that once you get socialized into it, it becomes a useful marker and signal to other people in that class that you belong and can fit into that social class. It both holds back people from working class backgrounds and accelerates social mobility for people in upper class backgrounds. So that's been the principal way that we've appropriated Bourdieu's work. This is an example of of quantitative analysis that uses a Bourdieusian framework. They took 150 years of British who's who. They looked at what recreations these aristocrats, wealthy people were putting down for themselves. They found that in the 19th century, there was a lot of golfing and hunting and fishing and sailing and horses, things that landed gentry do. That began to change in the 1920s as people in the who's who had more and more higher education, and higher education valorized the higher things. And so they began to list more things like hiking, music, reading, and the arts. So they would show that they weren't just ignorant toffs riding around hunting foxes. They were actually men of the people doing, men who had broad tastes. And this is, I think, for me, when I discovered the work of Claritas in the 80s, and they're still around and they still do what they do, they basically took the Bourdieusian idea of quantitative analysis of social habitus of these cultural worlds and said, let's start doing that and selling it to people. They created 66 different habitus labels for different groupings in the population. And they can tell you, based on thousands of data points for each zip code, what the proportions of these different habituses are and how to reach them, what journals they read, what magazines they read, what news television they watch, et cetera, et cetera. So this idea of habitus has actually been operationalized and commercialized for a long time. Now, let's get to individuation. If we take that our aesthetic tastes are strongly influenced by a variety of social factors, including these kind of Bourdieusian factors of living in particular cultural subworlds that have particular motivations. The idea that people still engage in self-exploration in order to try to find their true selves, their authentic selves, of course, is still true. This process of individuation, Gilbert Simondon has written a lot about individuation, popularized the term. I think although it's quixotic, it's obviously something people do. It's a process, it's a project. It has no possible solution. You never will find your authentic true self. You will simply engage in the process of self-discovery. Just because our epistemes, our norms, our aesthetics are all socially determined, it doesn't mean that wanting to broaden your horizons or explore fresh things or aspire to be a cultural finder, not just a participant. These are all legitimate motivations and things that people bring to the table when they engage with recommender algorithms. Okay, so in the field of research on aesthetics in general and now applied to recommender algorithms, one of the broad set of concepts is generalist versus specialist. And there's generalist versus specialist metrics for measuring people's behavior in things like Spotify. And these platforms are using these kinds of frameworks to try to determine what kind of cultural consumer people are. And then there's the concept of omnivorousness, the growth, the increase of people who have not just habitus linked tastes, but actually want to dip into the habituses of others, the cultural lives of others. And it used to be that omnivorism was strictly defined as the mixing of high and low. So you would say, oh, I like opera and I like country music, or classical and, gospel or whatever. But it is clearly a mark now of educated cosmopolitans like myself to have broadly international, diverse, unpredictable tastes and things. That's a sign of an educated, open mind. And I don't think that's necessarily bad, but it is class-based and class-linked. There also have been identified generalist diversity tastes and specialist diversity tastes. So most upper class mixing of high and low has been found to mix the most popular versions of high and low. They don't have a sufficient time and energy to go into detail. On the other hand, there are some people who go into detail. Instead of just liking Willie Nelson and Beyonce, they might like Hank Williams and Lou Reed. You know, they might drill down in terms of specialist knowledge in different domains. And that is a different kind of aesthetic choice. So Goss says here, she complains, algorithmic diversity is characterized as simply ensuring that the recommendations are different from one another, not necessarily catering to niche or underrepresented tastes. So for instance, she's complaining that in Netflix's algorithm, you can be dubbed a diverse consumer if you like the most popular comedy and the most popular drama, even though you have not really demonstrated that you understand anything sophisticated about drama or comedy versus other kinds of consuming. So these are broad conceptual categories that people are trying to apply. In terms of cultural omnivorousness, the study I referenced earlier found that omnivorousness, this high mixture of high and low brow tastes, certainly increased in England, that upper class people in England at least have seen the need to mix highbrow and lowbrow tastes. And I won't go much into more of that, but for instance, here in the United States, the National Endowment for the Arts has done research to look into why there's a decline in the audience from classical music, jazz, ballet, things like that. And they found that the principal cause is not that the people who just like those things are disappearing. It's that the kind of cultural omnivorousness that is associated with affluent, educated life in America used to include saying, I like classical music and I like rock. But now they don't need to say they like classical music anymore. It doesn't do anything culturally for upper class people to explore the higher things. Okay, a brief comment, this we've already gone over this many times, but just to say the core idea of recommendation algorithms is to figure out what kind of person are you and what kind of things do people like you like. So yeah, there's three steps. One is what kinds of things are there? There's the what kind of people are there, and what's the relationship between what kind of people there are and what kinds of things there are. And the modeling for that is diverse. There are many different ways to go about trying to create those models and those relationships. But you can see that basic pattern in almost all the recommendation algorithms in the aesthetic space. Amazon to the extent that it's an aesthetic space, but things that are frequently bought together, what kinds of things are there? And then what kinds of people are there? The customers like you tend to buy things like this. Instagram has a slightly different, Instagram's much more time bound, so it has timeliness like Facebook. It queues up the most recent things for you. But it's also looking at your sociometric network. So who do you interact with the most? Facebook does this also, and we'll bring those things to the top as opposed to other things. YouTube has a variety of different kinds of data that they put into queuing up your recommended videos, the amount of time that you spent engaged with different kinds of videos, the channels that you subscribe to, your liking behavior, your history, and it's a part of the Google Plex, so there's probably other stuff about you that's going into that mix as well. Facebook uses an inventory of everything that's available. It's a bit of a black box, but basically it's doing the same thing. So, okay, so the way I would frame the role of recommendation algorithms in our contemporary projects of self-exploration, as Karakali, let's see, the capacity of recommender systems to function as instruments of control does not exclude the possibility of their employment as technologies of the self. These are, as opposed to going to read, I used to pull down all the top 10 movie lists. This was like 20 years ago. Top 10 movie lists that all the different reviewers would publish at the end of the year, compile them in Excel, and then come up with my own list. Okay, these are the movies that I really have to watch because these are the ones that the experts want us to watch. Well, now you can go to IMDb or Rotten Tomatoes and do the same thing. And if you do it in a platform like Netflix, you get an immediate feedback from your behavior. Oh, I did or I didn't like this thing that I just watched. And what do you say now? If it's more immediate on YouTube than Netflix, but you can have an immediate refresh of the impression that your behavior is demonstrating to the recommender. So as an aesthetic guide, recommender algorithms are far more immediate, far more interactive, and far more empowering for individuals than simply the static forms of information that they tend to turn to in the past. Now, for the punchline, I would say the research, the empirical research actually testing the hypothesis that use of recommendation algorithms leads towards more homogeneity or more specialization or more omnivorousness or whatever the hypothesis, is pretty thin on the ground, because these are proprietary systems. To really do the kind of research, you would have to have access to proprietary data. So most of the research in this field has been indirect, interviews with executives, interviews with users, and so forth. But those who are familiar with the research that's being done in the proprietary space, the corporate research, are, and I could send you some of this research if you want, but they talk about things like the growing understanding of diversity-aware algorithmic methods. So we don't want to just tell people that, they're white men. That's going to be useful for advising them. We don't want to just tell them that they're white men who live at 56 Daleville Road in Connecticut, because that would also be useless. So how do we balance the amount of diversity, specialization, omnivorousness, novelty in an algorithm? This is an active, ongoing topic of research in this domain. But there is some research. And then, for instance, Anderson did a study on Spotify engagement. They had a specialist generalist measure and an engagement measure. And they found that, that their hypothesis was that Spotify was going to lead to more music specialization and more engagement by specialists. What they found was that specialist consumers with diverse tastes were more likely to directly engage with Spotify. That is, they were more likely to tell it, well, I like that, I don't like that, I subscribe to musicians' channels and so forth. And they were more likely to remain on Spotify than generalist consumers with homogenous tastes. So if all you want is what you're going to hear on Top 40 Radio, just listen to Top 40 Radio. You don't necessarily need to pay for Spotify. But if you really want to drill down and engage in music appreciation in a diverse range of fields with an expert that can lead you to the things you may never have otherwise discovered, then you stay on Spotify. Kind of confirms my hypothesis. So I think that a lot of this will devolve back to examining the innards of these recommendation algorithms, because the statistical and programming choices that they make about whether to provide general versus specialist advice. So this is, for instance, Netflix has millions of categories of films, and they are so specialized, their categories of films, that if you watched a film that was, a Christmas film for families from Europe, if you watch one of those, there's probably another 5 of those in Netflix's entire archive. And if you liked it, and Netflix only showed you those other 5 films, that would not be a satisfying Netflix experience, because they're probably all not that great. But if it generalizes and says, oh, well, maybe you're in the mood for Christmas films. Well, there's lots of Christmas films, and we can show you the top ones that we think you might like. So these kinds of programming choices, I think, will drive, and they're different for each platform, and drive a lot of how this facilitates or hinders our projects of individuation. Okay, I'm closing in on the end here. Let's see. Does it use express preferences, or does it also include your consumer behaviors, demographics, and social network? I mean, I gave up on the project of personal privacy a long time ago. So the idea that Google, all-knowing Google, might be using the fact that it knows where I live, who I am, who my family is, and all those kinds of things to inform other recommendations it might be giving me doesn't creep me out that much. It creeps me out some, but doesn't creep me out that much. And I'm willing to engage with it as an individuating partner. Does it try to guess your mood right now, or does it reflect the sum of your preferences over time? This is frustration from me with Spotify, is that Spotify, from my behavior over time, seems to think the only thing I want to listen to is calming ambient music, when actually sometimes I want to listen to something, you know, peppy from the 70s or whatever. And it's not able to read my mind yet, but I don't expect it to. And then finally, if we do the kinds of research I'm suggesting or accumulate it, and we find that algorithms have a tendency to encourage specialization or generalism or omnivorousness, what implications does that have epistemologically and normatively for the internet? In other words, if we're worried about internet radicalization, as I said at the top, are we worried about aesthetic radicalization? We find aesthetic radicalization, aesthetic specialization. Do we also expect that to have that same effect politically and epistemologically? Would it necessarily be a problem? I still think, as an Enlightenment thinker, that omnivorousness is best in all domains. And so perhaps that's what we'll find. So in sum, I just want to say beauty and authentic individual tastes are malarkey. Aesthetics are biologically constrained and socially determined. Some people pursue cultural diversity or specialization as part of their self-exploration and individuation. Omnivorousness and specialization are both markers of education and class. They are socially determined parts of our makeup. It doesn't make the desire to become more omnivorous invalid, but there's no authentic aesthetic separate from our social condition. Recommendation algorithms support both learning about the things in your habitus and developing a more idiosyncratic aesthetic. They are intimate experts for those seeking self-cultivation. Evidence that recommenders are impacting taste are mixed. There are studies that suggest homogenization. There are others that suggest specialization. The programming behind an algorithmic recommender shapes how homogeneous, specialized, or omnivorous the recommendations are, and therefore how useful they are for this individuating project. Thank you so much. And just in closing, I want to thank scholar.google.com, which helped me do the research, images.google.com, which helped me put together the PowerPoint, YouTube, Netflix, and Spotify, Amazon and Consumer Reports. I live in the context of these tools, and they have helped me a lot. Thanks. Bye.
Well, thank you, Jay. We have time for questions. Yeah, about, I don't know, 15 more minutes or so. So
did I take too much time, Maria?
No.
Okay.
It's just 11:30. So
okay, I get into the Pentecostal speaking in tongues, and
we could also, depending on what people prefer, have both talks and then questions at the end.
Isn't it more fun to talk about Jay's now that he just gave it?
Yeah, I think Maria's right. Let's do that.
So, what do you think, Maria?
Yeah, I think, well, let me see here what questions I had. So you kind of answered, I had written down some questions along the way, but you kind of answered a little bit because I was interested in the research, how much behind the, scenes you had gotten.
Yeah, as I said, the research, a lot of it is on secondary inference of this question, as opposed to direct. To really do it directly, you'd have to get a hold of that primary data, and not very many people have that. But
and then if I can, I had like one other question, like when you're comparing different platforms that has already different levels of variety on it. So like YouTube and Spotify really has a lot of stuff, where Netflix actually is kind of limited in content, right? And so like, did you discover any sort of differences in that? Like, because like in terms of omnivorousness, it's easier to be omnivorous on a platform that really hasn't censored much out by itself, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's an interesting paper out there actually critiquing the strategic use of global film in Netflix to present the image that it is a global omnivore, or that you could become a global omnivore by participating in Netflix, when it really isn't. And just the example of the Chinese drama, they did put The Untamed on Netflix, and that's where we originally watched it. But if you want anything else from Tencent, you basically have to go to YouTube, and where the quality is significantly different. But yeah, these different platforms have wildly different content. I used to be on Pandora. I don't know if anybody remembers it, but
Yeah.
Pandora had this whole music genome idea where every song had to be labeled on 50 different characteristics, and then they would use that to try to predict whether you would like it or not. And the huge advantage of Spotify is that it's a lot less labor intensive, and they could just take your behavioral data and use that to predict. So, but anyway, Spotify is about 50 times bigger than Pandora used to be.
So, Jay, any thoughts about as this shaping process takes place, regardless of whether it's responding to your omnivorousness or your specificity, it seems to me that there's certainly going to be things that it chooses not to show you. What do you think about the idea that we're being steered as much by what they don't show us as by what they do show us?
Well, obviously at the global level, government censorship is a huge issue. There's a lot that you can't see in China, other countries. And then there's the splintering of our streaming platforms. You know, the fact that now you can't watch Star Wars unless you sign up for this service, and Star Trek of that service, and so forth. So that has made it a lot more complicated, I think, to be an omnivore. At least it was a lot more expensive to be an omnivore. And that constrains what you can see. And then I don't think there's a lot of evidence. I started with a slide showing the different kinds of channels you can watch on YouTube. I mean, if you're a Nazi, you can find a Nazi channel. Well, maybe not outright Nazis, but pretty close. And so as long as the platforms permit breadth of left and right, religious, secular, all the different kinds of breadth that we expect, I don't see direct censorship in the recommendation platforms I was talking about. But of course, we've been confronting this for 4 years. What should Facebook flag as false news and that kind of stuff? So this issue of direct censorship and of corporate overdetermination of particular choices and recommendations is an ongoing concern. We have to pay attention to it.
My follow-up would be, so what about the indirect censorship that happens as a consequence of the algorithm itself, with no particular programming other than, well, we're going to show the things that the algorithm suggests and not show the rest?
Well, you remind me of Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson were married, and when they were doing research in, I guess, the Trobriand Islands or someplace, they had a fight about the best way to study their village. Margaret Mead said, you study the things that are most important to the villagers. And Gregory Bateson said, no, let's just set up a camera in the middle of the village and film everything, and then just watch that film. It's like the most boring Andy Warhol-ish film ever. I side with Margaret Mead. I think I think an algorithm is trying to pick out the important things to show you out of the millions of things there are in the world. If to the extent that they're censoring, if the algorithm is doing its job, it's censoring the things that you don't need to see. So yeah, I don't see that as a problem. I don't think that, I mean, and if you want to, you can look at every video on YouTube. You could find other videos, but that cue at the top, these are recommended for you for a reason. I think that reason makes sense.
Other questions for Jay?
Yeah, I have a quick one, Jay. That was a great presentation. Thank you. One question is, in your research, did you encounter any studies of groups, I imagine they are actually vanishingly small, that don't tend to click through on ads and don't tend to purchase as a result of their interactions with these purveyors of culture? And how do the recommendation algorithms deal with that kind of group or groups? And is that at all connected to how opera, came to no longer be a marker of class status?
So I'm not sure I understand the question, but
Yeah.
I think you're probably getting at one thing is that there are probably lots of different frames that you can put on consumer behavior. I would like a frame that says, I am a neophile. I want to see new stuff all the time. And other people are not. Other people want to see their favorites. And so hopefully in the background, there's that kind of a frame. There's a frame for commercial allergies like I have. You know, I as often as possible on Twitter or Netflix or whatever, not Netflix, but the other platforms, I try to turn off ads if I can and, you know, filter the ad recommendations. There's probably a flag in there someplace. This guy hates ads, you know, try to show them different kinds of ads or whatever.
I say.
So I do think that those would help in the specification of the tool. It may also create other problems, but does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. No, that's interesting. I mean, I can imagine that there are people. I mean, I think of who might actually pay to be my curators of culture, and I think there really are only three: Netflix, Amazon Prime, and Tidal. And past that, I am consuming for free, which means that I'm consuming as a result of ads I view or purchases I eventually make because of some indirect, scheme of click-throughs. And so I didn't know, for those people who don't even do those three, if they come to develop radically different preferences from those of us, whose tastes are more traditionally channeled by the flow of capital.
Well, I can tell you, if you're worried about ads, watch Chinese soap operas on YouTube, because the ads are all in Chinese, and unless you speak it, no impact, zero impact. Thank you.
I had a question. So great presentation. I learned a lot. I'm curious about the use of content filtering on other platforms, and I have, for example, dating sites in mind. And right, so I know I have no experience with. I'm married and was married before dating sites were, a thing. So I have no personal experience with them. But as I understand it, most of them are paid, with the exception of maybe, right, so I think Facebook is free. And but I know that there have been some interesting questions, and this might be out of scope of your presentation, but I'd just like your thoughts on it. There have been interesting questions associated with kind of certain preferences, right? So race, for example, is allowed on dating platforms. It's generally not a preference that most people express, that in polite society, it's not something that's generally it's frowned upon to express racial preferences for a whole range of other things. And right, a real kind of narrowing in terms of the types of potential partners that one might get as a result of the content filtering or collaborative filtering. I was doing some research on this, and there's an app called Monster Match, which is a kind of, the guy used collaborative filtering to show how with just a few swipes, you start getting monsters that are very similar to, it's a proxy for race and so on and so forth. So I'm not sure there's a question in there. It's more of just a request for your reflections on, other uses of this, and dating is just one.
No, the everything I said could be applied and is being applied to computer dating, matchmaking. And I have to say, I'd started a computer dating service when I was in college, so this issue has been on my mind for a long time. But the issue, eHarmony, for instance, has a social science research unit, and they publish fascinating research on this stuff about, how often do different racial groups as initiators of contact get responded to? How often do you get, asked on a date if you're different racial groups, male and female? The kinds of photos, the impacts of your cover photo, your recreations. They've looked into everything, and there's there's books out now about how to maximize your chances on a computer dating site by doing X, Y, and Z with your profile. So I think it's incredibly relevant. And in terms of the race question, that is, I think, one of the things Ariely, the quote I read at the top, is concerned about, is that to the extent that a platform says, oh, you're a white guy in your 50s, so you must be an angry Trump supporter, wouldn't get me right, but that would not be useful for my information. And if it starts trying to match me up with other female Trump supporters in the area, that's not going to be useful at all. So, the use of race, gender is such a powerful dynamic. I can't imagine not using gender, but we debate the use of race as a predictive factor, for instance, in higher ed statistics. If you throw a bunch of things in trying to predict who's going to retain as a student, and you find that race is a predictor, and then you set up an advising program and you pull kids in and you say, because you're this race and this gender, we think you're in trouble, man. That's not something you can do. And so you have to feed it through all these other mechanisms about, you know, academic preparedness or whatever. So I think we have an unaddressed problem with the use of these kinds of highly controversial social habitus markers in our predictions.
Cool. Thanks. Appreciate it.
Jake, quick question connecting your presentation and Dan's presentation from our first workshop. And the question has to do with the degree to which people feel connected to their own experience, or to the degree, to use sort of John Stuart Mill-like language, to what extent do you feel that the experience is actually yours? So this sense of emotive attachment to what happens to you is the existence of curation versus accidental finds, serendipitous finds, intentional finds. Is there a trade-off between, on the one hand, efficiency, and on the other hand, a sense of ownership of your own experience and engagement in it if what you come across has been curated for you? I mean, just sort of playing with, for example, the linguistic associations. When you go to a museum and you walk through a curated exhibit, you learn a lot, but it has been curated for you, as opposed to accidentally leafing through a book, finding a work of art that speaks to you, and then going down that road yourself. So it's the sort of, in a way, it's the serendipity question, or a little bit more broadly, does curation, especially curation based on commercial considerations, sit in conflict with your ability to own your own experience?
So that would apply to, so you're saying that if I just go appreciate the art that a curator picked out in a museum, that's less authentic, and I don't feel as much of a sense of connection as if I happen to serendipitously run across that art in the street? I mean, I don't understand. How can curation, what I would contrapose is the fact that we've all in the past relied on very imperfect curation of our aesthetic life, and that this gives us access to tools which have 1,000,000 times more products and 1,000,000 times more specificity about what you actually might enjoy. I mean, you ask your priest what you should read, they're going to recommend things that are in their interest, not in yours. So, I mean, I think in a way, these tools are much more intimately engaged in our own project of authenticity, whether a project I don't believe in, but it's a project, than the kinds of aesthetic influences that we usually absorbed in the past. So I just see this as more empowering for people.
Right, right. Let me clarify. Don't get me wrong. There is huge role for curation. And clearly we all experience a lot that has been curated for us by purveyors of taste. Although, again, usually the purveyors of taste are not always animated by commercial interests, although who's to say that the interests they are animated by are better. But what I'm trying to say, or ask actually, is whether those curated experiences before algorithmic recommendations were not the only kind of discovery or learning experiences we've had. We have had, in some ways, purely serendipitous ones. And I think that people often describe that they put special value on serendipitous finds. Now, most of the time they lead to dead ends. Some of the time they don't. It seems to me like the ratio between curated and serendipitous finds is changing. And that might not be a loss, but then it seems like we should have an argument for why it isn't a loss. Or is it just not even the case that the ratio is changing?
And let me jump in for a second. Just we're starting to eat into Maria's time, so maybe we can make this one the last.
Okay.
Sure. Well, just in terms of serendipity, there is research that suggests there's some computer modeling, for instance, that suggests that if you have serendipitous parts of your aesthetic, so for instance, you know, in my Spotify liked list or my Pandora liked list, there's a couple classical music, even a couple opera, although I generally despise opera. There's a little bit of gospel. The computer modeling suggests that most of these tools are not going to be sufficiently powerful to keep that as a part of my personality profile. And so that over time, it will rub off those edges that I may have discovered serendipitously and which might have led into whole fields of exploration if they had taken that opportunity. But instead, they're going to double down on the things that I liked 10 of or 20 of or 30 of. And so I think, yeah, I mean, if that's the direction it goes, then we become a little bit more homogenous because we lose those quirky, idiosyncratic, serendipitous discoveries.
Great, thank you, Jay.
Sure.
This is a great conversation. And next we have Maria Brincker, who's going to talk about from prediction to control. Maria is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. She has published on a range of topics having to do with concrete aspects of our embodiment and our social and technological embeddedness, and how these dynamically shape our brains, minds, and agency. She holds a PhD from City University of New York Graduate Center and was previously an Arts and Neuroscience Fellow at the Italian Academy at Columbia University. Take it away, Maria.
Thank you. Yeah, so given the title of the workshop with prediction, I try. This is called From Prediction to Control, but what I'm really interested in is perhaps like rooting it in this quote from Hannah Arendt that many writers have quoted recently, where she in The Human Condition writes, the trouble with modern theories of behaviorism is not that they're wrong, but that they could become true, that they actually are the best possible conceptualization of certain obvious trends in modern society. It's quite conceivable that the modern age, which began with such an unprecedented and promising outburst of human activity, may end in the deadliest, most sterile passivity history has ever known. And so I actually, Jay, I'm so happy that you gave this talk, because in a way, you know, you're exploring the outburst of creativity and diversity that this time allows us. But this quote, of course, suggests that that comes at the same time as a fear that this will precisely end. What I'm interested in is also this, normally, of course, what is so, in a way, shocking about this quote is that behaviorism is not thought as something that becomes true, right? Either it works or it doesn't work. Human psychology is like often thought of as fixed in time. And she's clearly doing this like, socially and environmentally and politically and economically situated view of the direction of the level of freedom in our action. This is, of course, from the early 50s, and the trends in society that she's talking about is, about mostly about labor, and but also, of course, about propaganda, and she has, written, of course, about totalitarian regimes. But what I'm interested in is seeing this in the context of the current developments. And so Shoshana Zuboff has quoted Arendt along with many others, and she's very much arguing that this kind of behaviorist stimulus response control is something we indeed should be very afraid of. So here, let me just, she goes into detail, like quoting Skinner, and writes about Skinner's excitement with this technology of behavior, and how we could like sort of instrumentalize human behavior. So she then takes examples like Pokemon Go and suggests that that this is a way of like herding people's behavior through these apps. And of course, the question that many people raise is, what is actually the problem with Pokemon Go, right? So many people will say, well, I don't care if they're herding me around. I like playing Pokemon Go, and I also like the Frappuccino that I got over at Starbucks, where Starbucks had paid Pokemon Go to make me go over there, right? And and if I don't like it anymore, I stop playing. So what is the problem here? And so I guess what I want to do is like try to think in a little bit more detail about what the problem might be and what this all has to do with behaviorism. So most importantly to what I'm going to say here is like the simple stimulus response relation. So if we can gather data on people's responses given certain stimuli, that learned relation can be used to predict people's behavior in future cases, and it can also then be used to control people's behavior in future cases if that prediction is correct, because you can present people with a stimuli and in that way control their response behavior, insofar as there is a tight correlation between stimulus and response. Okay, sorry. But I love this little cartoon, right? Because the question is, of course, with these stimulus response, so like from the perspective of the scientist here, he thinks he's controlling the behavior of these rats, right? And making them push the lever. But from the perspective of the rats, they might say, well, that they're controlling the scientists to give them food. So the question is, in these relations, like that from each of these perspectives, the other is a black box where you learn a stimulus response relation, where you learn a causal connection. And each time a human being learns a causal connection, you could say you gain some kind of control, right? So that there is a sort of empowerment in learning a causal relation, independently of what perspective this is seen from. So to some extent, you might say that there's a mutual control in Skinner's rat box, in the Skinner box, as it's called. Okay, so taking this then to a question of a system that is somewhat adaptive and self-regulatory, so like an algorithm. So we take a thermostat as a very, very simple feedback system. Then you could say, if you just have the temperature, then regulate the heating in the room, and then the room that changes the temperature, which then regulates the heating through the thermostat. However, such a thermostat is of course typically controlled from the outside, in the sense that somebody has put in a desired temperature, right? So maybe you want it at 70 degrees in your apartment. And in that way, even though there's a feedback system within, that feedback system is sort of controlled from the outside. Oops. And when we think of control of other human beings, I think it's important that we see that the other human being, of course, has a lot of feedback systems, right? But yet can sometimes be controlled in the sense that that a desired output can be created through some kind of stimulus. And here, what I'm trying to suggest is that, of course, if we have a thermostat, even if you don't have access to the main hall and you can't adjust the desired temperature, you can, if you want to stop the heater, you could put like a lighter, right, over onto the sensor or something like this, right? You can interact with this system from, there's like different points of access to control. And in this way, you can game systems even when you can't enter their sort of intimate controls, you could say. And in this sense, when you have a fixed system, it can actually be controlled from many angles. Okay, so why am I interested in this? One reason is that we see with these apps like that, for example, Uber here had, of course, is in control of the algorithms they use to, for example, for search pricing. But there are more and more cases, this is from last year in 2019, of drivers trying to game the system back. So of course, these drivers, so like the analogy here to the thermostat should be that these drivers don't have access to change the algorithm. But insofar as they can gain some causal knowledge of how the algorithm works, they can manipulate it towards a desired output. So in this case, drivers went to the airport, all shut off their app as if they had gone home. And then the algorithm said, oh, there's no drivers in the areas. Let's, search pricing, right? And then all the drivers click in to get the higher priced ride. So then, okay, Uber thinks this is a breach of terms of conditions and etc. And the possibility of exploiting the app in this way typically vanishes when it's been gamified in some kind of way the other way. But it is still interesting to see how these things are possible. It's happened in other areas too. So like Amazon Flex. So like it's similar to Instacart, where you have drivers that get orders for delivery. And there was a case here in September where Amazon drivers were hanging smartphones right next to Whole Foods, so that the phones, showed like extreme proximity, and all the orders will go to these phones, and then collaboratively people sync with these phones that are hanging in the tree to get the orders. This was accordingly also, according to Amazon, also a misuse of of their terms of service. But there's a similar sort of, you could say, counter control from the perspective of the gig employees. So what I am hoping to get some feedback on from you also is how to think of these kinds of cases. What kind of control have the drivers obtained, and how should we think of it in relation to the control that is had by the companies and the owners of these algorithms? The question is, in a way, if there's a mutual control, or if these are sort of Pyrrhic victories to some extent. Why would they be Pyrrhic victories? Typically, the behavior of these drivers will be observed by the company, and the loophole will be shut. As their but I don't know. This could just be a cat and mouse game, as many are in tech development. However, I do want to sort of look at a more extreme case of control to, I guess, sort of frame maybe a more scary future. So these cyborg roaches have been invented by these two computer scientists, Latif and Bushcourt, and they work such that there's like cyborgs, right? So like there's a little chip on their back, and that chip can then feed stimulus to the antenna of the roach, and also there's also a stimulus like to the back of the roach that it typically is. It's of course guesswork to say how is it sensed by the roach, but the general sort of interpretation is that it feels something like an obstacle, like that it's bumped into something on each side, or that something is behind it, chasing it, perhaps from the stimulus from the back. And it's certainly the case that the reason why they put the chips in this way is because it is effective in having them turn left and right and having them move forward faster. So in this sense, they can, in terms of their physical movements, be simply actually remote controlled through controlling the stimulus to their antenna. So in this sense, you could say, okay, this is a classic stimulus response learning, like that the scientist has learned the relation between a stimulus and a desired response, and can then apply the stimulus to control the response, to the extent that you can make these roaches work like they are completely remote controlled by the will, you could say, of the person applying the stimulus. And this, you know, like they have all kinds of positive purposes of like saving earthquake victims, etc. But I'm not interested in that here. I'm just interested in how it is conceptualized. What is this kind of control? And the authors themselves compare it to having a horse with bridle and reins. And this is of course interesting because the difference between a horse with bridle and reins and these cyborg roaches is that the horse knows very well that it would like to eat the grass that is to its left, even when it's being turned right. So like there is a really big epistemological difference where you could say that the roach is actually in a sense choosing to go left because it senses a obstacle. So even if it wanted to go right eventually, like in this local action, it is in a sense you could say, I don't want to give too much interpretation of the consciousness of roaches, but insofar as they're perceiving that obstacle, they are making the turn as an intentional action without knowledge of how the layout of the world actually is. Okay, so they write, we help the cyber roaches to decide which direction to go to. And I think that line is nice because I think that a lot of tech companies and algorithmic recommendations are helping us decide where to go. Okay. There's of course this huge like behavioral economics literature on nudging and choice architecture for humans. And what I just want to highlight from this literature is that people typically agree that there's no such thing as a neutral design, that all designs are has a choice structure built into it, and that, you know, I think might be interested in the discussion too, in terms of like everything is curated kind of debate from earlier. Yeah, I'm not going to go into more detail about that. However, in terms of algorithmic design and personalized feeds, etc., I do think that it's very important to notice that this question of the choice architecture can of course become different for all of us, right? So like there is whereas if you create spaces in our shared world, these are precisely spaces that will look the same for all of us. And I have a quote here from Lessig in his very I find very early, I would say, like a book where he writes that code is law. I do think that code is law, but I think that it's important to really also think about like, whereas like law regulates our behavior in a shared space that the law itself does not transform, the way that code is law is like regulatory, not only in terms of access and permission, but also in terms of the terrain itself, in a way that we don't think of law in meat space or in physical space. Why is that important? Well, that's important because if we have a sort of a landscape of choice, that this sort of extreme flexibility of the coded space means not that we can be trapped in various ways. So one way that if somebody would like to present me with a stimulus to make me choose this optimum, one way of doing that is to hide the other possible optima that I might have chosen had I seen them. Another way to direct me towards this local optima would be to make the cost of access to other choices too high. So this would be like Jay's example with how now you can't access content through, you have to go through a specific platform, for example, to get to a specific content. And most of all, this personalized to the individual, right? And so, and flexible in time. So it's maybe not the same for me even from one moment to the next. This, of course, is really socially problematic in a democracy. This we will leave a bit aside for now. What I want to focus on just here is that the way that my friction with others and our disagreement and negotiations of understanding a shared world, of course, also is what typically opens my mind to expand the options and choices that I might try to seek. Here's an example of some personalized artwork on Netflix, and how different viewers see different posters for the same content. We can project a little bit into the future, and I don't think we will see the same content also after we click. That the personalization will be deeper. And if we go in that direction, I would like to, I hope in the discussion we can relate that back to your omnivore question, Jay. Okay, so many thinkers, of course, have worried about how access to an understanding of people's stimulus response relations and in general, like extreme privacy loss and exposure can be used to control people more like they are an object or a thermostat than actually engaging with people as subjects. So here are some quotes from Foucault that I'm going to sort of skip over. The part that from Foucault that I do want to highlight a little bit is the point, which is also already in the Bentham's original Panopticon letters, that visibility is a fantastic way of studying people and optimizing and expanding the levels of control that we can have on each other. So like in terms of like first expanding ability to predict, and in that way expanding ability to control through prediction. Okay. Yeah, I think, well, how much time do I have? Yeah, we want to have
about 3 more minutes or so.
Okay.
Maybe 4.
Yeah, so like I'm gonna skip this part. Like Tristan Harris, like I don't know if you saw a Netflix recommendation algorithm, like his social, like the Social Dilemma movie. He focuses very much on how what can be exploited. Sorry, is the knowledge of our human weaknesses. So that knowledge of how we react under certain conditions that makes our own decision powers weaker is. And making us more addicted, etc., is this something that he's incredibly worried about? I'm not going to go so deep into that, but I hope that you see it relates to the question of the stimulus response control. Shoshana Zuboff highlights that she thinks that this is not, what we're seeing is not like an issue of complete privacy loss, but rather a redistribution of who gets to have privacy, who gets to have the rights to choose what data about them is revealed, and in that sense, which aspects of our behavior we allow others to influence and control. Yeah, I'm going to skip this. And so this is my last slide. So returning to Arendt's quote, I shall attempt to sort of summarize and answer why are we increasingly behavioristically controllable, right? So stimulus response controllable in the current, in our current modern society. It seems that some of the key elements here is that there is this sort of asymmetric or redistributed privacy, which exposes users of tech platforms. It exposes their behaviors and stimulus response relations to a different degree than the behaviors and stimulus response relations of the owners of these platforms and the coders of the algorithms are exposed, and even the algorithms themselves. That is not to say that we can't learn something about them, which we also talked about in terms of Jay's talk, but there is a clear asymmetry. Further, we are behaving in landscapes that are designed to control our responses and to optimize control often. And these landscapes are not only designed to evoke a certain behavior, but they are personalized such that behavior of different people in different scenarios can be controlled differently. That personalization prevents us from having objective and shared knowledge, and it also in that sense prevents us from having social and collective resistance. So the two examples I gave with the gig economy workers were of course examples where people are actually we're collaborating to sort of flip the script on the algorithm, which was behaving similarly towards everybody, right? So here we had a case of an algorithm that had the same performance for all, and everybody could make a collective response. Lastly, I think it's very important to see that the control levels carries forward, so that like the problem with like the Pokemon Go response, that I can just stop playing Pokemon Go, is that that deal is not necessarily done the moment we stop playing Pokemon Go. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Okay. And if you can stop presenting.
Yes. Sorry, I just need to.
There we go. Great. Right. We have time for a few questions. Go ahead, Jay.
I liked it. It reflects, I think, I'm going to sound like a broken record, a certain amount of ahistoricity, in that I think feedback loops are an essential part of nature. We can find them everywhere. Behavioral feedback loops have been a part of controlling our behavior since we were squirrels. And the question, I think, is there an authentic self that a behavioral model is missing that is real? I'll just give you one example that Netflix used to have and try to predict what you would like on the basis of the things that you had added to your must-watch list. And then they discovered that people add lots of documentaries to their must-watch list and never watch them because their self-image is that they want to be the kind of person who would watch a documentary, but they never actually do. And so the only thing that's truly predictive is your behavior over time. And all these models do make that presumption that the best way to know people is not through some personality inventory where you give an idealized version, but where your actual behavior guides it. I'll just point out also Skinner, he wasn't, it wasn't a prescriptive dystopian prescription for the direction society should go. He was simply saying, if people behave this way and these feedback loops are possible, we could create a better world. That's what Walden 2, his novel, was about. You could create a better world based on this understanding of human behavior. So I don't see it as the prescription for a total control dystopian corporate regime. But I did very much like the invocation of local and global maxima. I think that that is a very useful way to think about things. And an example would be, I think, if an algorithm is really good at telling you what your peers, family, friends are into and taking you deeper into an exploration of your habitus, that could be considered a local maxima. It fulfills a lot of good stuff in your life. But if it keeps you then from exploring the omnivorous, parts of other habituses and that would make you a more idiosyncratic individual, you may be missing out on some global maxima. And I do think that is a useful way to think about it.
Any response, Maria?
I didn't hear any question. I don't really, I don't really agree with your, if you read Freedom and Dignity, for example, of Skinner, it's pretty clear that he thinks that freedom is a past notion. If knowledge is perfect, there's no freedom. No.
Yes, but that's a description of the state of reality. It's like what I said at the top, that our aesthetics are all socially determined. It's not a prescription, it's a description. If it's true, then we have to figure out how we make a better world and actuate freedom in that context, right? So I understand why people were horrified by the suggestion that there was no authentic self and that we could predict everything about human beings from behavior, but it may be true.
No, so I'm not interested in authentic selves. I'm interested in freedom, right? And of course, the idea of total knowledge, right, is an idea of the idea that there could be one description that really captures everything, right? Like that there is this sort of totalizing knowledge. I don't believe in that. I think that in that sense we are different perspectives on this world, and however, if you allow the predictive control to be unidirectional, you can also in a way mute and you can say muffle the diversity of knowledges and viewpoints of others, and in that sense create a world that is without black swans, as to use Taleb's point, right? So I think in terms of the sort of descriptive and prescriptives, I might have a difference in terms of metaphysics than Skinner in terms of the descriptive, how is the world really, but he does have a prescriptive view of knowledge gain, right? So that's a historic movement, right? And that in terms of the more knowledge, the more determinism, right? The more in that sense that the less local freedom, you could say, right?
Okay, thank you. Somebody else near, were you jumping in there? I saw you. Bill, yeah.
Yeah, a quick question. It seems like great presentation, Maria. Thank you. Really provocative. It seems like there are empirical claims being made in both of today's presentations that it would be really interesting to hear more about. For instance, Nir, I took your question for Jay as being, is there an empirical basis for saying that a curated experience feels less authentic? Right? Just what do people say when you ask them after that type of curated experience? Did that feel less authentic to you? And so in much the same way, I wonder if we can kind of test Arendt's hypothesis by just asking whether or not people who are embedded in these kinds of control systems feel like their lives are passive and sterile. And I want to play the devil's advocate and just suggest that actually we probably don't feel that way. I mean, sometimes I get mindless in my consumption of culture on Amazon Prime or Netflix, but it's very active. In fact, if anything, I often wish that the control systems would spend less time pestering me. And it certainly doesn't feel sterile because I do discover the long tail of uniqueness and watch the Ukrainian folk band perform in the video on YouTube. So I just didn't know if you had reactions about attempts to empirically test some of Arendt's hypotheses about what it feels to be embedded in a control system.
For me?
Yeah, or just
no, but so the whole point of the robo roach was that you're not going to field track.
Right.
The whole point is that from your perspective, you're optimizing. From your perspective, it's going great because you don't see, right, the engineering of the landscape. And typically, and what is, Kevin, I was so sorry that I had to leave right after your talk last time. I really enjoyed it. But some of you were talking about manipulation, right? And of course, the really tricky thing is if I come over and I'm like a manipulator, you're like, screw you, go away. I don't want to have dinner with you, right? But if I'm manipulating your landscape and you don't see me, who are you going to break up with, right?
So how does that bounce off of, that's a really incisive point. I wonder how it bounces off of empirical claims like taxi cab drivers are able to infer Amazon's reward system in such a way that they can go meta relative to it and exert control. It seems like if their experience was passive and sterile as they interact with the Amazon machine, that they would not be able to go meta and re-exert control. So, cultural spoilers happen. And I'm just wondering how that bounces off the phenomenology of being part of a control system.
Yeah, so this is where I was like saying, like, what is so interesting about that quote in relation to Jay's talk also, right, is that Hannah Arendt is saying we are in this moment of enormous empowerment and free, like what she's describing in the 50s, right? And I see that now, like there is one part of it is this sort of, a massively powerful, and you see it precisely on these platforms. These very same platforms are, the fuel of all sorts of creativity and energy and reaching out and, ability to do things we were never able to do before. And in that sense, an expansion of freedom, right? So like our time now is like living with several tendencies, right? And I think that like it is really interesting, the creativity. So there's whole YouTube channels on YouTube trying to game the YouTube algorithm, right? Like and because like the influencers know, like I have to. They changed it on me now. It used to be if I post 3 videos a week and it's about like this time of night, like then the algorithm opposite. Now they've changed it on us. What are we going to do, right? And so this is a whole, what I guess I was like sort of being pessimistic is because of the asymmetry of control of that algorithm, right? So I don't want to downplay the empowerment and the control. That was hence the 2 sides of the thermostat, right?
Got it.
I come over with the lighter, right? So but it's just in the long run it looks like a losing game because they can kick me off the platform as one thing for one, right?
Just to enter that conversation, I mean, there is one level at which both Bill and Jay, because I understand this to be some of the thrust of the argument, this is an empirical question. And it's interesting to look at as an empirical question.
Wait, so I didn't get what is an empirical question?
Well, to what extent do people actually, feel/experience, their freedom?
But that's not a claim I've made. I just maybe Bill is making that claim. I'm not making any claims about how people feel.
I understand, and I also, if I understand you correctly, see you to be saying that they're meant to feel that they're continuing to be free anyway as part of the design of the larger interaction. But there also, I guess, is a way in which this isn't an empirical question at all, and that is, historically speaking, there is a series of metaphors by which, whether they have a ground or not, we think about ourselves. So you sort of late 18th, 19th century, you have romantic metaphors which emphasize spontaneity and emphasize a degree of creativity. With those metaphors of self-understanding, even if they're not true, actually certain social institutions develop. Well, if humans are this spontaneous creature, that gives a pragmatic grounds for human rights, because that is the uniqueness that needs to be defended by human rights. Now, this may all be bullshit, but it's culturally accepted bullshit. And that is, in some way, as a pragmatist would have it, that is a lot of what matters. If you have entering the zeitgeist increasingly this idea of predictability, this idea that we are profoundly predictable, maybe the predictability is even good because it makes you discover the Korean boy bands and the Ukrainian folk singers and so on and so forth. But the point in some ways is, once you start self-understanding as a profoundly predictable creature, apart from even whether the predictability is empirically grounded or not, does that have a seep-through impact to how you understand certain basic social institutions, what you understand the valuable human being to be, and so on and so forth? I mean, this is a bit of what I'll talk about in my talk in the third installment, namely, does the sort of pervasiveness of predictive technology start changing people's self-perception to be more predictable? or as being more predictable, and does that matter politically? Does that matter socially? And I'm not sure that's an only empirical question, I guess, is part of what I'm saying.
We are actually at the end of time. Well, not all time, just the time for this meeting. And I have some things starting right now. But I'm happy to let this keep going under Nir's supervision. But wanted to say that I thought it was a great conversation, and I really enjoy getting together with you folks. So,
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah. You
okay,
too.
bye everybody.
Bye.
If you guys want, we can keep talking. If you have somewhere else that you need to be, excellent as well.
Can I ask a question of Bill?
I think, yeah, there's Bill. Yeah, of course.
Bill, did you have a test in mind for the control hypothesis? The problem I have with trying to operationalize Maria's framework is that I think we're all controlled in various ways, that there are feedback loops pervasive in human behavior. So I don't know where you would find a difference in what we're doing now.
So just like, I don't think, I agree, right? But the question is, so if there's like a multiplicity, right, of feedback loops, like then it really matters who gets to control which loops are the most powerful in which moment, right? And so like I'm like, you know, like I'm fine with like, you know, cybernetics and complexity, but the problem is actually the limitation to complexity when the scope of the system is defined from one angle, right? Rather than, and I think that a lot of our freedom actually lies in our ability to switch context, right? So like and be like, so like I was thinking on your, like, you know, like in many ways I took your talk to be describing also the algorithms we would like, right, to have, right, or like more than the ones that it was prescriptive rather than descriptive, right? Like that and there we would also like the button that resets, right? Reset my algorithm because you've gone off a limb, right? Like, and please reset, right? But we don't. So this is like, you know, who has the controls, right? So like what I study like also, you know, I'm really interested in privacy in animals, right? And the kind of like information managing that animals do in terms of power games with each other, right? And that of course makes me worried when I see like a huge asymmetry in those knowledge games, and like who gets to control which feedback loop.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, Maria. I mean, my question, I guess, was just very narrow in scope and maybe uninteresting for that reason, right? Which is that it strikes me there are some domains where, because we are mutually entrained, right? These are reciprocal feedback loops, where my relationship, even with the dominant purveyor of culture, is certainly not passive. And it does not seem to be homogenous either. I mean, I do have novel discovery from these large purveyors of culture. And so I was just kind of, you know, picking a nit that what if I ran a controlled experiment with a group of 100 people and say, you know, here's $50, spend it amongst these content providers as you will. And then I kitted out the content providers with certain kinds of entrainment style algorithms, and then surveyed the people afterwards and asked them, did you feel that your experience was passive, or did you feel that it was sterile? And I just suspect we might get, you know, mixed results. I don't know. But I understand that you have a more, Maria, it sounds like more objective theory of agency, you know, that might come into some tension with Jay's, you know, more subjectivist theory earlier. Good stuff. Thank you. I'm learning from both of you.
Yeah, I'm learning from you.
Any other thoughts, questions? All right, friends, very good to see you all. And we will be in touch before the third and final installment, which I think is on December 1st.
Okay, great. See you.
If anybody wants my slides, just email me and I can send them. And I'm also working on a paper. So
excellent. And I will send around the link to the recording as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.
Bye.
Have a good